The Military Creation Act of 22 BBY formally re-established the Republic military for the first time in nearly 1,000 years, shortly before the start of the Clone Wars. But surely, you might wonder, the CIS kind of being the only threat the Republic faced in that time period? Well, you'd be right. The Republic faced many threats over the course of its golden age, and that in turn begs another question. How did it deal with them? In this video, we'll be looking into exactly that.
Attention, Sergeant on deck!
1,000 years before the Battle of Yavin, the Jedi Lord Hoth's Army of Light was victorious in the 7th Battle of Ruusan, a conflict that marked the end of the millennium-long New Sith Wars and, seemingly, the end of the Sith altogether. The years prior had been hard ones for the Republic. The New Sith Wars were a chaotic sequence of conflicts that saw various new Sith orders rise and fall, with each shedding blood on a galactic scale before eventually being replaced. By the final century of the war, the Republic was severely weakened. The Republic military was in tatters, the Jedi Order was scattered, and the Sith even stood a chance of conquering Coruscant. Sith infighting allowed the Republic to survive, but barely so. The next 100 years would be known as the Republic Dark Age, and during that period, the Republic barely even existed outside of the core. It was the Jedi that ultimately saved the galaxy from the Sith, with Jedi Lords across the galaxy raising armies on distant worlds and marshalling the remains of the Republic military. They ultimately united into the Army of Light, and beyond all hope, they managed to vanquish the Sith, allowing the Republic to rebuild. But with the Sith threat gone, Supreme Chancellor Tarsis Valorum decided he would do more than just rebuild the Republic. The Sith weren't the only reason it had nearly collapsed. It had a number of internal problems that crippled it, and Valorum sought to correct them. And thus, he proposed the Ruusan Reformations, which reshaped the Republic into what we know and love, ushering the Republic into the Golden Age. The Ruusan Reformations did many things, from changing how the Senate worked to eliminating Jedi lordships, but one particular aspect of the resolution is relevant today. The Reformations dissolved the Republic military. The Republic wouldn't have a centralized military force for the next 1,000 years. That didn't mean the Republic was defenseless, however. The assets of the Republic military were instead divided between the planetary security forces, smaller militaries that, after the Reformations, were maintained by individual sectors or occasionally individual worlds. The size and weaponry of these PSFs were heavily restricted, but for the most part, they were allowed to operate as they saw fit. This system saw mixed results. For the most part, the PSFs did work out quite well at first. They all started off fairly well armed due to the distribution of Republic military assets, and as the leadership structures of the first PSFs were generally composed of ex-Republic military personnel, they were all fairly effective too. But time, and more importantly complacency, took its toll on the PSFs. The Republic did nothing to ensure that they remained equal, and the advancement of technology, the spread of corruption, and the disproportionate nature of threats began to be a serious problem for the PSF system. PSFs in the core worlds were largely ceremonial, as the region was fairly safe from piracy and the dangers of that time. Which meant the corruption and complacency that spread among the ranks there wasn't all that damaging. But while the core PSFs mostly ignored the flaws in their personnel, they did maintain quality in their equipment. They were constantly updating their warships, starfighter, and weapons technology, exploiting loopholes in the Ruusan Reformations for increasingly large and show-offy fleets that rarely saw use. At the same time, the PSF system in the Outer Rim began to break down after a few centuries. Many Rim PSFs couldn't afford to replace their equipment, and even by the time of the Clone Wars, many of them were still using old Hammerhead cruisers and Aurex starfighters, which by that point were nearly 4,000 years old and incredibly outdated. Manpower was always insufficient, and corruption problems also had severe ramifications here. Combined with others, these issues rendered PSFs unable to defend their homeworlds from pirates and other threats. But the PSFs weren't the Republic's only military forces. The Republic did retain one last vestige of the centralized Republic military, the Judicial Forces. The Judicial Forces were a rapid response fleet intended to intervene in local military affairs when need be, and they consisted of the Judicial Fleet, a limited ground unit, and the Jedi Order. Theoretically, when a local PSF couldn't handle a problem or a sector became embroiled in an internal conflict, the Judicials would be the ones sent into the breach to stop the bleeding. But it didn't always work out that way. Over the centuries, the Judicial Forces began to atrophy, and by the time of the Clone Wars, there were more crises than there were judicial task forces to fix them. Even before the Separatist crisis, the Judicials repeatedly failed to stymie the galaxy-wide piracy epidemic, forcing Outer Rim sectors to turn desperate. Many were forced to allow the Hutts or the Trade Federation to gain a foothold on their worlds in exchange for protection. The post-Ruusan military system of the Republic was put to the test repeatedly over the course of the Republic Golden Age. For the first few centuries, the system seemed to work well. In the 900s BBY, the Judicial Forces were highly successful in the Unification Campaigns, a series of engagements that reunified the Republic after the chaos of the new Sith Wars. They proved their worth again in the Mandalorian excision of 738 BBY, a massive attack on Mandalorian space that saw the Judicials lay waste to many Mandalorian worlds, turning swaths of them to deserts of white sand. A campaign intended to prevent the Mandalorians from becoming a threat to the peace of the Republic. But, as we established earlier, this didn't last. Complacency in the core led to decay everywhere else, especially in the Outer Rim, which became increasingly vulnerable. Pirates in those remote regions frequently took advantage of what they saw as the Republic's weakness, bullying Rimworlds and building up small empires in wild space. Many of these Rimworlds just couldn't afford to build up their PSFs to compensate, and many of the ones that could were hampered by the arms restrictions imposed by the Ruusan Reformations. In the last centuries of the Republic, a solution came in the form of the Trade Defense Force. By the time of the Clone Wars, many mega-corporations had built up private armies as so-called security forces, but most of them were incomplete and not intended to function as full militaries. The Trade Defense Force was the exception. With a fleet of warships, countless starfighter squadrons, and even a private army, the TDF was a true military, and it blew right past the limits established by the Ruusan Reformations through a mix of legal loopholes and secrecy. In the Outer Rim, the Trade Federation began offering the assistance of the Trade Defense Force to weaken PSFs, often in exchange for those worlds granting Senate votes or a monopoly on resources to the Federation. Many Rimworlds complied, gladly letting the Trade Federation take over due to the effectiveness of the TDF. For its part, the TDF did indeed keep its client system safe and was much more successful at fighting piracy than the Judicials or any PSF had ever been. But, of course, there were problems with the Trade Defense Force too. The Trade Federation was completely unaccountable, and it used its military assistance as leverage to all but take over Rimworlds, viciously exploiting them even more than the pirates had. This only got worse as the years went on. The Trade Federation became greedier, and as it became greedier, it became more paranoid as well, constantly increasing the size of its forces right up until the Battle of Naboo. By the Republic's final century, many groups within it began calling for the re-establishment of the Republic's military in light of the failures of the PSF/judicial system. One of the most vocal supporters of the militarist cause was Randolph Tarkin, a native of Eriadu who, in 57 BBY, set about making his vision of a new Republic military a reality. He built up the Seswena Sector Planetary Security Forces, contracted private companies to build them reinforcement fleets, and then made alliances with neighbouring PSFs, who then did the same. Tarkin united these fleets under the banner of the Outland Region Security Force, which patrolled a large swath of the Rim that he called the Greater Seswena. The ORSF all but crushed piracy in the Greater Seswena, and as it grew even stronger over the years, Tarkin began to openly refer to it as the Republic military. He argued that the Republic should use the ORSF as a basis for remilitarizing the entire galaxy, flaunting the Force's campaigns against piracy as proof that his model worked. But the Senate dragged its feet, so Tarkin sought a larger conflict in which to prove the effectiveness of the ORSF. In 44 BBY, he got one. That conflict was the Stark Hyperspace War, a brief conflict that, while limited in scale, sent shockwaves around the galaxy, born out of a dispute between the Trade Federation and the Stark Combine over the Bacta trade. The Republic wanted the dispute settled diplomatically in a conference on Troikan, but Tarkin had other plans. He intended to arrive at the conference with his fleet and crush the Stark Combine, which he hoped would give him the leverage he needed in the Senate. The whole affair was a disaster. Stark seeded Tarkin's warships with a Navi computer virus that destroyed much of his forces and forced the rest down on quotile. 5 battles between Stark's men and the Republic forces, and the conflict only ended when the Judicials arrived, finishing off Stark's fleet just as Tarkin ensured the destruction of the Combine's ground forces as well. The Stark Hyperspace War was the beginning for the end for the PSF/Judicial system. Despite the Republic victory in the conflict, the war nonetheless highlighted many of the flaws in relying on the PSFs and the weakened Judicials. While the militarist faction wasn't immediately successful after the war due to how Tarkin's forces performed in the conflict, they did ultimately win the debate 22 years later with the passage of the Military Creation Act. So, that was how the Republic defended itself before the clones showed up. But what do you think? Would you like to see more videos relating to the Old Republic in future videos? Let us know in the comments section below. And just before you go guys, make sure you check out all the links in the description below, including our main Geetsly's Discord, the Patreon if you want to help support the channel more than you already are by watching this video, and our Geetsly's Gaming Network if you want to play games with other Star Wars fans, including our Roblox which is in development, and our Gary's mod. Anyways guys, as always, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.